Hey, welcome to RPYA. My name is Joel, if we've never met or had a chance to meet. I'm on the staff team here at Church at Rocky Peak, and so I'm just glad that you're here. If this is your first time to Rocky Peak or RPYA, glad that you're here. Maybe you don't even know why you're here. Your friend said we're going somewhere, but here you are. So we're glad that you're with us. I'm excited. Tonight we're kicking off a brand new series that we're going to be spending the next 4 weeks in as we gather here on Sunday nights, and it's called True Worship. And as you think about that idea, that word worship, I would imagine that for many of us, all sorts of thoughts come to our minds. Many of us would have some kind of a faith background or religious upbringing. And so we would think like, oh, I know what worship is. And like it might include things like music or like candles or something like that, right? Like some of you may not have had like any kind of religious upbringing or whatever. And so it's just like, that's that weird thing that those people do when they go to church, right? Like you might have this whole broad awareness. But here's what I think is true. You worship whether you know it or not. The question is, what do you worship, right? Have you ever been caught up in a moment or an experience where everyone was engaged or gathered around something and all their attention was drawn to it? Like Friday night, millions of people worship Netflix, watching the most gimmicked fight in history, right? Like that would be an example of that. Let me date myself a little bit and introduce you to what I think is one of the greatest musical artists of all time. We have his picture. His name is Sting. And some of you are like, who is that? And then if you're asking that question, your parents have failed you horribly. In the 80s, Sting was the lead singer of a band called The Police. And so if you've ever heard the song Every Breath You Take, 3 of you love it. Yeah, like, go educate yourself. Get on Spotify right now, and educate yourself. So Every Breath You Take is one of the most beautiful yet horribly possessive love songs of all time. So when my wife Christy and I met, this was my favorite artist of all time. And so he had just dropped a new album back then, and one of the songs had this beautiful lyric. It was like this love song. And in the lyric was this: "She moves in the logic of all my dreams." And I was just like, that's beautiful. And I remember when I met Christy, I was like, and it's you, right? Like it was just this beautiful thing. So Christy knew early on how much I love Sting. And so in our first year of dating, she surprised me for my birthday to go see Sting in concert. So we were living in San Diego at the time. She spent the money to get tickets to go to this huge outdoor amphitheater. And so I was so excited because I wanted to see this guy my whole life. And so I remember we show up to the venue. It's packed and crowded. And so where are my fellow introverts at? Like the things we hate would include crowds and traffic. So I have to go through everything I hate to experience this moment. So I remember we get there and I'm starting to get hangry. And when you're early dating, you're trying to put your best foot forward, right? So I'm just trying to be cool Joel, but I'm not feeling it. So it's not I'm working really hard to power through it. The opening act just sucks. Whoever they had, they started their song over halfway through. Right? This is professional level. It was just this terrible. And I was just this is the worst. I'm not having a good time. I got to impress Christy. And, and then I was saying everything just goes dark. And all of a sudden you just hear this musical note start. And then the spotlight hits and there's Sting standing there in front of thousands of us that have gathered around. And all of a sudden, the energy changed. And all of us, all of our attention and energy was drawn to this moment. And there was something awakened within me. And I was I was made for this moment. It was just, and so for the next 2 hours, we just basked in the presence of his greatness, right? And I remember leaving that moment and realizing this simple idea. That was a weird sort of worship. Because in that moment, we had given him our time, our attention, our money, our affection, everything, our energy was directed towards him because we thought he was worthy and great enough to give that to him. And in a sad way, that was a kind of worship that happened that night because we were worshiping by giving all those things to him. And really that's really what worship is when you're giving yourself to something that you think is worthy of who you are to give it to. That's a very basic understanding of worship, which means that if you've ever given yourself to something like that, you've in effect worshiped that thing. Or maybe it's the person next to you, right? Don't put that pressure on them, but some of you, you're doing that right now, right? Because you're love is awesome. And it's yeah, and it's hard work. Buckle up and grow up, right? But you'll get there. You're young. You'll figure it out, right? But there's this premise, and the reason why I would say everyone worships is simply this. We were created to do that. Out of the gate, we were created to worship because we were created for worship. Have you noticed that about yourself? Even if you're the greatest at whatever you do, you're not great enough It's going to sound weird, but you're not great enough to carry your own greatness. Like you were meant to orbit around something greater than you, because you're not great enough to even handle how great you could possibly be. You were created to do this, to orbit around something else. And the reason is because we're not the center. Like, how many of you have friends that think they're the center of it all? Yeah, I mean, you can call them out, that's cool. But like, that was a rhetorical question, but that's all right. Right, but like being around somebody who thinks they're the center, that's not an enjoyable person to be around. And if you've ever tried to make yourself the center of all, you realize what a lame endeavor that is, because you're just not able to create that. That's why like we have depression in our society, because we're lost in what we're meant to revolve around, and we think it's all about us, and yet the more we make it about us, the more we can't fulfill and satisfy the needs that we have. So we were created for something more, and the reason why is that we were created in God's image. Like, you look at the opening story in the book of Genesis, whether you believe it verbatim or you think it's fantastical, it's still telling us truth about our origin, that God did something unique with us in all of his creation. Like, we're told that when God formed the man from the dust of the earth, he breathed his breath of life into him, and that's when we're told that we became living beings. Like, there's something in us that uniquely received God's greatness, his breath, and now we're created to reflect it. And have you ever just stopped and wondered, like, why did God do that? Like, if God is so great, why did he need to create us? And the fallacy of that is the word need. It's not like God didn't need to do that. So it's just like, have you ever just pondered that? Like, God, why did you do that? Like, were you bored? Were you lonely? Were you just like, I just want some people to push around? Like, why did he do that, right? Like, and let me tell you, here's why I think God created us. God knows exactly how awesome he is. And he wanted to share himself with others so we could experience his awesomeness. So God creating us was a gift to us to experience him. And that's why we were created, like, so that our greatest joy in life would be to know who God is, to reflect who he is in and through our lives to the world around us. That you and I would know no greater joy in all of existence than to know who God is and to be in relationship with him, and to experience the awe and wonder of who he is. Like, have you ever just had your breath taken from a beautiful experience in life, like a sunset, or has anyone ever experienced that? Like, you're just caught up, like beauty has just captured you in a moment and you can't really explain what it is. Like, that's like a glimpse within you that you were created for something magnificent. And that was the goal of us knowing who God is and experiencing him. And the problem is that if you read through the Genesis story, something goes wrong in the chapter 3 where we don't believe who God is, and then we're lost to who God is. Like, we experienced the death he warned us about. We experienced separation from him. And so we lost relational life with the one whom we were meant to know and orbit around, whose beauty we were meant to experience and to reflect to one another. So we lost the center of our worship, but we didn't lose the desire for worship. There's still within us this desire for that. And that's why we're looking for things in this world, in your journey, in my story, in the history of the human race. We're looking for those things that will satisfy us and fulfill us. And that's why we give ourselves over to those things. So whatever you're giving yourself to, whether that is your time or your energy or your affections, that's you pursuing through worship that which you think will fulfill or satisfy you. That's why we have like stupid things in our culture today that are just like I went and saw the Kings game Friday night. Not a huge hockey fan, just going with a group of people. I was amazed at how many hockey fans there are in Southern California. I lived in Canada. It made sense there, right? But here it makes no sense. But I was just dumbfounded with how many people there are. But like, how many of you have a favorite sports team? You know, I'm not going to call you out for worshiping them. I'm just asking if you have one, right? Like, yeah. Do you ever use like the improper language around that? Us and we, when you're talking about your team? Like, you're not on the team. You don't own that, right? But like, because you're a fan, right? Like, and you want them. I've never understood it because I'm not a huge sports fan, but I understand it. Like, there's people that are so enamored with sports that like their team, so they're defeated or they're sad the day after their team loses, as if somehow it was them. I'm like, dude, like, what's wrong with you, right? But I'm not a huge sports fan. I'm a nerd, right? So growing up, I had other hobbies that I gave my time and attention to. Just recently, we helped clean out my parents' house, and I found this old box, and I opened it up, and I found these figurines in it. I think, yeah, like these wizards and such. And I was telling my daughters, they were like, what are these? I'm like, oh, Me and my friends were so into this when we were younger, like we would spend hours hand painting these things so we could play Warhammer Fantasy Quest tabletop with dice. Like it was so amazing. And they're like, how old were you? And then I felt really lame. I was like, I was 22 years old. And there's this moment where for a whole weekend, 3 days straight, my friends and I sat at our kitchen table hand painting these figurines so we could have a big fantasy fight with our stupid little figurines. So much like my body ached after that because I was sore from hunched over, right? But in this moment, I'm giving my time and my energy and attention to this. Oh, it's funny because that's King Orion, king of the Wood Elf army right there. I worked hard. And then we found the female queen, and she was just painted white, but I hadn't painted her yet. And the girl's like, how come you didn't paint her? I'm like, oh, because that's when I moved to San Diego, so I had to put everything in this box, and I hadn't opened it since. And then Christy's like, yeah, and that's when he found a real woman. I was like, okay. You are right. You saved me from this. Thank you, right? But you look at you know why politics is so divisive for us? Why we just can't simply work together as a democracy to figure things out? It's because we put all our hopes in the possibility of who that person is, so much so that if they lose, we're devastated and we think the world is over. Or if they win, we're like, ha-ha, and because we're giving all of our time and energy, we don't know how to worship what matters most, so we worship lesser things, right? This is why some of you, the relationships that you're in are dangerous for you because you don't know how to actually honor that person for who they are. You're putting all your hopes and dreams on them. You're putting a disproportionate weight upon them to satisfy and fulfill all your needs, and they will fail you miserably, and it's not their fault. It's because you're worshiping something wrong in that relationship. But it's this reality within us that that's what we want to do. So whatever you give yourself to, that's a form of worship. We all do it because that's what we were created for. And so this is why worship matters, because whatever you worship, it shapes who you become. So if you worship lesser things, if you give yourself fully to lesser things in this world, you'll become a lesser kind of human. Because that thing isn't great enough to fulfill who you were meant to be. So you'll become a smaller version of yourself. You'll become a more broken version of yourself, depending on what that is. And yet the reality is if we learn how to put our worship back towards God, the one whom we were created to worship, that's when we actually become greater versions of who we're meant to be. Because we're actually now reorienting our worship around the one who we're created to reflect. So that as we begin to worship God again, we're reflecting the one in whose image we're made. And our greatness emerges around his greatness. But it's not a greatness that makes us arrogant. It's a greatness that puts us in our proper place of alignment with him. And so that's why when Jesus came, he said, I've come to restore this relationship. And if you read in John 10:10, he's talking about Satan. He goes, the thief has come to kill, lie, steal, destroy, to take us out. But remember what Jesus said? I came that they may have what? How many of you remember that? Life to the what? To the fullest. Because he came not only to restore us to our relationship with God, but to restore us to the humanity that we were created to be. And so as we encounter Jesus and walk with him, he reorients us back to relationship with God so that we begin to step into the greatness we were created for, the fullness of life we were meant for. So that's why following Jesus really matters. So in this series, we're going to assume a couple things right out of the gate, some things that we've been talking about. One, first, we're just going to assume, hey, we were made to worship. Now, you may not want to use that word. You may be like, I have hobbies. Cool. But if you're giving yourself fully to it, you're worshiping that hobby. Right? And worship is whatever you give yourself fully to something. And second thing we're going to assume is that there is no greater worship than when we encounter God and experience what he's doing and we learn to give ourselves fully to him. That's the worship we were created for. And so I want to start with just a simple definition of what is worship in relationship to God. What does that mean then if we're going to worship God in the sense that we are created to? And so here's just a simple concept. Worship is your response to what you believe to be true about God. Worship is your response to what you believe to be true about God. And so if in your life there is no response in your life to whatever it is you've come to realize about who God is, that means there's no worship in your life towards God. Worship is a response of some sort, right? But it's not simply a response, it's a response to what you believe to be true about God. So this is why belief about God matters. Because if you believe faulty things about God, you will have diminished worship about God. So if your God is just some distant being that maybe doesn't care about you, your worship's not going to be that great because you're like, who are you? It's like an absent parent that there's no relationship, right? But if your God is the God that Jesus reveals, that's going to fundamentally transform the kind of worship you're going to have towards that God and the kind of life you'll begin to experience with that God. So this is why Paul writes this in Romans 12:1, and we looked at this a few weeks ago. If you're a part of Rocky Peak, we've been going through the book of Romans, and so this simple verse is where Paul captures this idea. He says, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. And see how that definition is here in the thing? Like, what's your response when you have a proper view of who God is? And so he's saying, like, in view of what God has done for you, the gospel, Jesus showing up in your life and story. And some of you may not have a full clue of what that is, which is like, hey, hang out. We'd love to introduce you to Jesus so you have a deeper understanding of what God has done for you. But the more you understand this gospel, what God has done, his mercy on your life, what Paul's saying is the most logical thing you can do in response to that is to say, God, here is all of me. I give you my life. And that's worship. And so it's more than just music, though music will have an expression in which we worship through our songs, but it's so much more than that. It's the response of your life in view of what God has done for you. And so what I want to do is we're kicking off this series tonight as we're jumping in. I want to dive into this conversation that we see Jesus having with this woman in his day. And they're going to get into this little conversation about her life and what is going on. And in the middle of this conversation, they're going to have this theological discussion about worship and what God desires. And I think it's a fascinating thing. And so I want to take a look at it. So if you have your Bibles, open them up to John's Gospel. We're going to go to John chapter 4. And it's this fascinating thing that we're going to see. And part of the reason why we want to look at what Jesus has to say about this is because we believe he's more than just some cool teacher who lived 2,000 years ago. It's because of the claim that this is God's Messiah, God's Son coming into the world. And as we follow Jesus, he helps us understand who God is. And so we see this fascinating conversation begin to unfold between Jesus and this woman. And so Jesus, a Jewish male in his day, is going to have a conversation with a Samaritan woman. And Jews and Samaritans didn't like each other back then. Like they're on the opposite side of the railroad tracks in their day. So this begins an interesting dialogue. So let's jump in, John chapter 4, verse 1, and just see what we discover. It says, now Jesus learned that the Pharisees, this religious group in his day, had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John. Although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. So Jesus is starting to gain in popularity. The religious establishment isn't liking his popularity. Jesus knows this isn't my time, so he's actually stepping back from the public limelight in this to go and regroup and then to continue his ministry. And so now he had to go through Samaria. So this created a problem for the Jews. They didn't like to travel through Samaria. It's like, what's the worst part of the valley? I'll let you tell me. Okay, yeah. So it's like, I don't want to go through Pacoima. We're going to go all the way around Pacoima if we don't, right? It's like that. Now, I didn't say anything about Pacoima. That's what the crowd gave me. So if you're from Pacoima, take it up over there, right? But I mean, that's the idea, right? Like, but Jesus is like, we are going through Pacoima at night walking, right? Like that's how bullshit. So he'd gone, it's not time, it's daytime, but whatever. So he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. And Jacob's well was there. And Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. And when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, will you give me a drink? And his disciples had gone into the town to buy food. So he's hanging by himself outside of the town. He's thirsty, and this lady comes up, this Samaritan woman. And so the Samaritan woman said to him, you're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. So like this is like this woman's like, what is going on? Like, you're a Jewish man talking to me. We're not supposed to hang out. We're not supposed to talk. What's going on, right? So Jesus is like, this is what I love about Jesus. Whatever like the cultural barriers are, he's kind of like, let's talk. Right? So if you've ever felt like, God, how could you ever reach out to someone like me? Jesus is like, I don't care what the culture says. I want to talk to you. I want to have a conversation about life with you. And so she says, how can we do this? So Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. So this is an interesting phrase Jesus is talking about. Like if you'd actually known who was asking you for a drink, you would ask me for a drink, and I would give you living water. Like water that's like sustaining the depths and thirsts of your soul, not just quenching your palate, but I'm here to like do something deep. Jesus actually talks about this reality of living water in John 7 a little bit later, that this water he wants to offer is for everyone. He's like, anyone who believes in me, streams of living water will come from their life if you experience what I've come to do for you. So he's starting to have this initial conversation about this. And so she says, sir, the woman said, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock? And Jesus answered, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, meaning the water from this well. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. So if you'd like to take notes in your Bible, just right next to that, he's not talking about actual water. Right? He's talking about, like this is a metaphor of like, I've come to give you that thing that you've longed for that's missing in your life, to lead you back into that. And so the woman said to him, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. She thinks he's talking about water. And so he told her, go call your husband and come back. I have no husband, she replied. And Jesus said to her, you're right when you say you have no husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true. You're like, Jesus, like he's getting personal. First of all, how does he know this? Because he's never met her. So she's kind of like, whoa. But you're also like, I don't know, like that's a weird way to like try to make a friend. Your life is screwed up. You are right? But they're talking about thirst, right? And Jesus is trying to help her understand, I know that you are thirsty. That's why you're on your 6th relationship. Like, how do you know when you're thirsty? Is it not when you're chasing things in this world that no matter how much you grab after it, it doesn't satisfy? Like, how many of you are thirsty? Just get honest. Yeah, like you're like, I want something more than what I found in life, right? So here's where she's at, right? And so Jesus is just going to the heart of the matter with her. This is what I love about Jesus. Like sometimes we're like Jesus, can you just be gentle with me? And he's like, no, let's get real. And so he's going into the depths with her to point this out. But that's an uncomfortable thing. Like, have you ever just had an experience where God's kind of pushing at something and you're like, can we not talk about this? So she's not comfortable with this part of the conversation. She says, sir, the woman said, I can see that you're a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, meaning the Samaritans, we worshipped on this mountain. But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. Does that not seem like a weird response to what he just said about her personal life? Like, does that seem weird to you? You know what she's doing in this moment? She's like, I don't want to talk about this issue. Let's make this a theological debate. Then we don't have to get personal. Like, have you ever done that when God's trying to get personal with you about something and you're like, I don't really want to address the implications of what this is. Let's just have a theological debate, right? So like we do this in all sorts of things, right? So we're talking about our sexuality. Well, I mean, just the way they lived back then, that was how they did it back then. We don't have to follow those things now. Like, as I don't want to be challenged in my dating and sexual relationships, so please don't call me out on that. Let's instead talk about ancient courtship practices and whether they apply to us today. That's lame. That's dodging the issue of the heart God's trying to get to, right? So whenever you are getting into uncomfortable places that God's working on your heart and you just want to have a theological conversation about it, you're probably missing the point of what God's trying to do, getting into the depths of your heart, right? And so Jesus is like, this is why I just love Jesus. He's like, okay, we want to have a theological conversation. Let's do this. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Again, you could say, Jesus, that's pretty rude. You know what he just told her? What you believe about God is wrong. I know what is right. Have you ever had like a theological conversation with a friend who believes something very different than you? And have you just like said like, no, I think you're wrong because I think what Jesus says is right. Like that doesn't fly well in our culture, does it? Because you know what our culture kind of says, like, well, no, that's my truth, right? You're like, that's cool that that's your truth. I'm more interested in the truth. Are we willing to have that conversation, whether we like where it goes or not? And what's interesting, I think we've lost that ability to have that kind of conversation in our culture anymore, right? Because truth is now a weapon, and when you bring up the concept of truth, well, that's just what the powerful use to oppress the weak. You know what you say when someone brings that up? Is that true? Because if it's true, it sounds like you're using your perception of truth as a weapon against me right now. Like, if you're going to play the game, let's play the game, right? Like, can we just stop playing the silly game and just have the uncomfortable but important conversation? Regardless of how we feel, can we just wrestle with the truth? Because here's the deal. If this is real and this is God speaking to us, I want to know that, because this is the path that leads to life. If this isn't, then can we just check it off the box and continue the journey as we go about it, right? And so here she is. He's not afraid to have the uncomfortable conversations. He's not afraid to challenge people. He goes, look, salvation comes from the Jews, because he knows who he is. He knows he's Messiah. He knows what his mission is. And so he goes, yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. So catch what Jesus is saying here. This is where we're going to hone in for a little bit. Jesus is saying like worship matters so much so that there's a right way to worship. And it's a worship that revolves around understanding who God is, this idea of God being Spirit, but also truth about who God is. But not only is there a right way to worship, there are those who are actually true worshipers. There are those who are getting it right and those who aren't. And so then the woman's response to this, the woman said, I know that Messiah, called Christ, is coming. And when he comes, he will explain everything to us. She's like, listen, we can't figure this out. We need somebody who has the inside track to come and tell us what it is. And Jesus' response is this. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I am he. So, lady, the one you've been waiting for is right in front of you. And I'm telling you the truth about who God is. Are you thirsty or not? And it's this powerful moment. And this is why like paying attention to Jesus actually matters, because of the claims that Jesus made about his life. I don't know if you've ever taken religious classes and here's all the options, but Jesus' claims really matter. Listen, I just want to tell you a couple things that Jesus said. You can write this down, look at them later. But in Matthew 11:27, look at what Jesus says. Listen, he goes, all things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. What Jesus' claim is I know who the Father is, and if you want to know the Father, come talk to me. I'll make him known to you. That's quite a claim. John 14:6-7, Jesus says this, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. And so that's why if we're truly on a journey, a spiritual journey, we're truly seeking God, what's the truth? We need to take Jesus seriously because of the claims that he made. And we either come to the point where we say, Jesus, I believe you, and in believing you, I've come to the truth that will now set me free. Or Jesus, I don't think you're the truth. I'm going to continue my journey elsewhere. But we can't play games with Jesus. He doesn't give us that option, right? And so if you're here and you're like, I don't know what I believe about Jesus, I want to encourage you, be on the journey to figure it out. But don't dance in the middle. At some point, you have to take him seriously and wrestle with what he said about himself. And the beautiful thing is that if Jesus is telling us the truth, guys, we just found the one who can solve the thirst problem. We just found the one who can bring us living water, who can bring us back into the life we were created for. And if Jesus is the one who can do that, then we want to pay attention to what he tells us about worship, because he knows who God is and he's going to tell us the truth about how to do it. And Jesus talks about this, that we're going to worship God. If we're going to worship him correctly the way he wants, then it's in spirit and it's in truth. And that has implications, because that's what true worshipers do. According to Jesus, true worshipers worship God in spirit and truth, because those are the kind of worshipers God is looking for. Like, who do you think is the most important person in the equation of worship between us and God? Is it you? No, it's God, right? So who do you think's opinion probably matters most? No, but I like doing it this way. Well, cool. But what does God think? Like, God, what do you want? Who are you looking for? I want to try to be someone like that. I want to learn how to become a true worshiper, somebody who worships in spirit and truth. And so I just want to spend some time unpacking this idea that if we're going to truly become the worshipers that Jesus is talking about here, true worshipers, what does that mean? And so I just want to unpack this idea because it's spirit and truth. And so let's unpack this. True worshipers, a couple things that true worshipers are not. Here's the first. True worshipers are not limited by place. See, why did Jesus tell her that a time is coming when you're not going to worship as a Samaritan on your mountain, your holy site, and worship won't actually be in Jerusalem in the temple anymore? Why would he tell her that? Because maybe he was describing a time that would come when the reality is that wherever we go, we can worship God because God's not limited to a geographical place. Which is why he says that God is spirit, or we must worship in the spirit. So follow me. I want to unpack like a lot of theology in like a 90-second window, okay? So Christmas is coming. How many Christmas fans? Yeah, okay, yeah. Wow, okay, it's going to be a happy Christmas here. Christmas is coming. We're going to start to unpack all the things. You go to the Christmas story. When the angel comes to Mary and says, blessed are you, you're going to get pregnant, and everyone's going to think it's a lie. Ha, good luck, right? But do you remember what the angel tells her you're going to call this child? What are some of the Christmas names? Emmanuel. Emmanuel means literally God with us. So here's God come to be with us through Jesus. And then you follow Jesus' teachings. And one of the things that he says is like, hey, I'm about to go, on John 14, it's like, I'm about to go to the cross. I'm going to pay the price for you. I'm going to go back to the Father. I'm going to be interceding for you. I'm paying the price for all your failure. Follow me, but I'm not going to leave you alone. I will send another, a comforter, a counselor, the Holy Spirit. And when Jesus promises to send the Holy Spirit, he's actually fulfilling the ancient promise God made to his people in Ezekiel. So if you read the story of God's people through the Old Testament, it's a hot mess. God's like, I will be faithful to you, be faithful to me, it'll go well. Why are you worshiping all those other gods? Like that's basically the Old Testament in a nutshell. And they just can't get it right. They can't follow the law, they can't do it. And so God makes this beautiful promise in Ezekiel. He's like, I'm going to remove your heart of stone. I'm going to give you a heart of flesh. And I'm going to give you my spirit who will be in you to guide you and lead you and move you to follow my commands. Like God's promising to a broken human race, I will help you become who I created you to be, because there will come a day where I will put my spirit in you. And when my spirit comes into you, I will move you and guide you to listen and follow and walk with me. And this is what Jesus came to do, to restore that broken relationship that was lost in Eden, but to make it better. Because Eden was us walking with God on the outside. On the other side of the resurrection and what Jesus has done, it's now us walking with God as he's on the inside of our lives. So what that means is that you're not stuck having to go to a specific place to worship God. Because God's not limited to a single place. If you're a follower of Christ, if he's come into your story, wherever you go, God is right there with you because he's in you. That means you can worship God, where a true worshiper can worship God wherever they find themselves. It doesn't mean you can't have special places. Like sometimes, like my daughter likes to drive to the ocean and watch the sunset, and it's a powerful thing. That's beautiful. But God's no more there at the sunset than when she's sitting in traffic, because God is with her. It's almost like, but she's like, God, we're going on a date, right? So that's that beautiful reality of what that is. But God's on the drive, right? You understand? Like, that's the beautiful thing. So what that means, a true worshiper is not limited by place. You can worship God just as much here when he's showing up in our time of corporate worship than when you're sitting in the boring class or the dead-end job or working wherever it is. God is there with you. There's this beautiful book. I would encourage you to get it, called The Practice of the Presence of God, by this ancient monk, this old dude named Brother Lawrence. And I remember reading it as a young man, and it was revolutionary to my idea. And I just love the simple thing that he says here. We got a quote. He says, the most holy and important practice in the spiritual life is the presence of God. That is, every moment to take great pleasure that God is with you. You understand like how beautiful that is? That we can worship in spirit because God's spirit is in us. If we're followers of Jesus, if he's rescued us and set us free, that wherever we go, God, there you are. Like I don't have to like jump through hoops. I don't have to like travel miles. I don't have to go on a pilgrimage. God, wherever I am, there you are. And so true worshipers are not limited by place because God is spirit. But something else that true worshipers are not, they're not driven by preference. because we must worship in truth. Not just spirit, but also in truth. That means what is true about God. So let me just say some things that, this is a trigger warning. I think we have to do that for your generation now. I'm not sure, but your personal preferences do not determine what is true about God. I think we have this backwards idea, like we're so identity driven right now in our culture. And so like I will tell you who I think I am, whatever that is, on a sexual frame or an animal network of some furry or something, right? But whatever it is, and it's my right to self-identify, and I demand that you affirm who I say I am. That's our culture right now. We don't give God the same courtesy. God, we'll tell you who you are, but we're going to tell you who we are. How dare we do that? Like, God, if I have the right to determine who I am, does not God have the right to determine who he is? Of all beings in the universe? So why would we not allow God to self-identify and self-determine? That's why Jesus says in truth. Truth matters when it comes to our worship of God. And the reason why is because worship is not about you. It's about the one you're seeking to worship. See, God has a preference in how he wants to be worshiped, which means that our preferences don't determine what worship is. It's, God, what do you want? How do you want this worship to go? Like imagine you went out on a date with someone and they were so excited to take you on a date and they're like, tell me everything you love and everything you like. I'm going to plan the whole day around you. So you just put it all, you're so excited. And then you go out on this date with this person like, yeah, I don't want to do any of that. We're going to do everything I want to do. That's called a narcissist, by the way. So if you're dating someone like that, we'll help you. Like let us know. We'll help you get out of that relationship. But that's how we worship God. Hey, God, I know what you said about what you want. Forget it. This is how I want to do it. And we approach God like narcissistic little beings instead of saying, God, how do I come to you the way you want to be worshipped so I experience the truth of who you are? Remember what Jesus said, if we hold to his teachings, we'll know the truth. And what will that truth do? It'll set us free. Like one of the greatest freedoms that we can have is recognizing that God is God and we're not. That's when you experience freedom because no longer do you have to carry the burden of being God. God, that's your department? Awesome. How do I worship you and follow you and step into that life? And so here's a couple so true worshipers, it matters if you're going to be a true worshiper. So how do we grow in that? How do you and I grow in our ability to be true worshipers? Well, let's revisit those two ideas and look at them again. If we're going to grow in our worship, if worship is about spirit and truth, let's talk about the truth side for a little bit. If you're going to grow in your worship, then here's something you got to pursue. You got to pursue divine intelligence. Like, God, what do you say about reality? Divine intelligence is way better than artificial intelligence. How many of you are passing school right now because of ChatGPT? Yeah, all right, yeah, honest people, yeah. You're like, yes, make me smart, right? Yeah. AI is I'm not one of those guys who, as I get older, I'm afraid of the technologies of the world. You know, like, because like 100 years ago, electricity, we're all going to die. It's like, no, like, let's embrace the technologies, right? Although I do think the Terminator movies were prophetic. We'll see what happens. But there's like tests coming out right now that the more we're becoming dependent on AI, simple things like Google Maps, we're actually becoming dumber as a species. Like parts of our brain are actually shrinking because, like, how many of you have ever heard of something called a Thomas guide? Yes, you guys are gonna die if there's an EMP, if the zombie apocalypse. Like, find old people and keep them safe, right? Yeah. So before we had digital maps in our phones or in our cars, we had this book called a Thomas guide, and it was filled with maps that were just like, so all of California was in one book. And so you're driving up the 5 to go visit your friends maybe in Northern California, and you have to open the Thomas guide that tells you what road you're on, and then you get off the page, and then you got to find the corresponding page and flip to the next page in the book, right? So does that make sense in concept of how you would use that? Yeah, here's the problem. You're looking at a map, there's no blue dot, right? You are here, right? So you literally, if your friend has the Thomas guide, they're looking at exits trying to find where they're at because our brains were having to learn information in a different way. But now we're just using AI. AI doesn't make us smarter. It's convenient, but we don't become smarter because of it. The interesting thing, though, when we pursue what God would tell us about reality, when we allow God to illuminate us, we actually become smarter. Proverbs talks about this, how the knowledge of God leads us deeper into truth and beauty. So Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. That the more we actually discover the truth about who God is, the more we get in touch with reality, the smarter we actually become. Because remember at the start, like you were created to orbit around something greater than yourself? Like your greatest version of you is the view that builds your life around God and you orbit around Him, because you're like some object orbiting around the sun who's just basking in the energy and light of the sun. Like the more we orbit our existence around God, the more we're becoming who we were meant to be and created to be. As we pursue truth, we become more brilliant. And so worship is our response to what we believe is true about God. And so the more we know the truth about God, the greater our worship actually becomes. That's why, by the way, we'll never be bored with worship, because we'll never fully understand everything about God. God is the great adventure. That means for all of eternity, we'll constantly be understanding more about who He is. Right? So like God is love. Some of us understand that because we've experienced that, but the reality is we've only scratched the depths of what it means that we're loved by God. So some people think like, heaven will be so boring. We'll just be singing songs. It's like because you have a lame view of God. Your God is too small. God's like the most exciting adventure we'll ever know, because for all of eternity, we'll be like, you're amazing. 1,000 years from now, you're way more amazing than I thought. That'll be the adventure of eternity, that we'll experience this with God. And here's the thing, like a true worshiper is somebody who's gaining an intelligence. This is why you're actually drawn to someone who's a true worshiper, whether you realize it or not. And by that, I don't mean somebody who's like really expressive in their musical worship. Like some of you are like musical dancers, you know? And we're actually got to get out of your way. So you're like, hey, you're going to karate chop me in the worship, right? Like, so when I say like you're drawn to a true, I don't necessarily mean somebody who's passionate or expressive in their musical worship. Though there's beautiful passion in that. Although I think we have to be careful, because sometimes we're worshiping the experience than the one the experience is leading us into. We just always got to be careful with our passions in our worship, to not worship those passions. But here's what I mean, like you're actually you're drawn to a true worshiper, because when you realize that this is a person who knows who God is, and they're worshiping God in truth, and they're not simply driven by preference or even circumstance, you realize there's something powerful and beautiful in their story. Like here's somebody going through the hardest day of their life, and yet they have hope in their story, and they say, God, I still trust you. That's worship. Like there's a strength in that person that you're drawn to when you see it. That's why when your life is falling apart, you reach out to your friends, because you realize, I need your strength right now. And sometimes when it's the hardest day, you reach out to your strongest friend, the person that you know has just been showing you the most steadfast approach to worshiping God. Like true worship is something beautiful, because it's not preference, it's not circumstance, it's not how you feel in a moment. God, this is your truth, and I trust it, so I choose you, and I give you my life. That's a beautiful, powerful thing. Something else, the second idea if you're going to grow in worship, it's truth and it's spirit. And so it's learning to practice God's presence everywhere. Like wherever you go, like there God is. I remember 16 years old, my very first real job, I worked at a Baskin Robbins, scooping ice cream. It was so fun. And it was like a mind, like you can only create so many ice cream cones and sundaes for people before you begin to hate ice cream. Like, it was terrible. But I remember my pastor once talking about this, like, hey, God's Spirit is with you, and so wherever you go, there God is. And I began to like really think, like, God, if that's true, then when I'm scooping ice cream, you're with me. If that's true. Otherwise, you're just waiting for me to show up to youth group. And so I said, God, I'm gonna test this. So every time I go in to scoop ice cream, I'm just gonna invite you to go into the ice cream case with me. And I'm just going to like talk to you as if you're there, as if we're working together in this moment. I'm just going to invite you to come into that moment. You guys, it changed how I scooped ice cream. Like one of the worst orders was when someone would come in and ask for daiquiri ice. That was like the hardest ice cream known to humanity, right? They're like, I would like a pint, and you're like, I'll be back in 3 hours, right? Like you're just down there like scooping the stuff, and it became like such a moment that whenever I go into the ice cream case, and I would just invite God to come into that moment with me, and God, like here we are together, and like thank you for being so good in my story, and just show me her. I actually longed for people to order daiquiri ice, so I could spend more time in the ice cream case, scooping ice cream with God. Like, it changed the way I worked. It gave a dignity to my work that I didn't know I had. It changed the way I treated my coworkers. It changed the way I treated the customers. Because my work became an opportunity for worship. Because God wasn't limited to the church building that I was going to at the time. Like, it's this beautiful thing. Inviting and practicing God's presence wherever you are. I love how David just writes this beautifully in Psalm 139. He says these words in verses 7 through 12. He goes, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you." So here's something I would encourage you to do in your relationship with God and in your worship. As you seek to practice the presence of him with wherever you're at. Here's a simple, beautiful prayer to do. God, here I am. God, here I am. You wake up in the middle of the night and your thoughts are dark and you're wrestling with stress or whatever it is, to just say, and God, here I am. And the darkness is light to you. You're bored out of your mind. You can't reach any of your friends. You don't realize that your service provider has dropped you. You think everyone has abandoned you. You're just like, no one cares. But God, here I am. Here I am. I would just encourage you to just invite that simple prayer. God, here I am, and I just want to be aware of you and invite you to come and meet me in this moment. Because God, I want to be a true worshiper who worships you in spirit and in truth. And you know why God responds to that? Because Jesus said, those are the worshipers the Father seeks. It means he's already waiting for you to show up to worship him in the way he wants to meet you. And so when you invite him to come and do that, it's a beautiful, beautiful moment. And that's the kind of worship that transcends place and circumstance and struggle and challenge. You can worship God on your highs and you can worship God on your lows because he's God of all of it. I want to take a look at this story in the book of Acts as we wrap up. This amazing story of some of the early Christian leaders. Acts 16, let me just give you the snapshot of what's going on here. Paul, one of the early Christian leaders, he's in the city of Philippi. They're spreading the word of God, and some powerful things begin to happen. And as they're just spreading the good news about who Jesus is, they encounter this girl she's like in slavery. She's like demon possessed, and her owners are using her because they get money for her telling the future and stuff. So she's like doubly enslaved, human enslavement and demonic enslavement. And so Paul and Silas just happen to walk by her, and they just go, in the name of Jesus, like, be set free, right? And so she's set free in that moment. And you would think this would be an awesome moment, but the owners are now pissed because they just lost their money, right? And so then the whole city is stirred up, and they start spreading this lie around Paul and Silas and how they've come to bring foreign gods and destroy Philippi and the whole story and all this stuff. And so this is what happens to them. In verse 22 of Acts 16, it says, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas. And the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he had received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. Is that a good day or a bad day? That's a bad day. About midnight, Paul and Silas were. Imagine that was you and me. We're hanging out. God, we're on mission. We want to serve you faithfully. We see somebody oppressed. We see somebody beaten down by the world. And in the name of Jesus, we bring power and healing, and we set them free. And then the whole situation turns against us. And suddenly we're severely beaten and flogged, and we're thrown in prison. And I'm like, but God, we did the right thing. We did it in your name. Why is it? I thought we were supposed to be the heroes. I was expecting a parade or at least like a book deal or something. Like what is this? If this is you and I in that moment, what would we be doing? Because let me tell you, I'm going to be hard-pressed to not be crying foul. I'm going to be hard-pressed to not be saying, where are you, God? I'm going to be hard-pressed to not be hurt and angry and disappointed. And yet here's Paul and Silas. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. And the other prisoners were listening to them. Why? Because these were true worshipers who understood spirit and truth. That God, this circumstance doesn't determine our response to who you are. The circumstance doesn't make you less. The circumstance gives us an opportunity to make you more. That in this moment, we're going to recognize what is true, that you are good and you are worth our lives. And if this is the price of following you, so be it, because it's not the end of our story. And God, we got to see someone set free in your name today. So God, we're going to give you glory and we're going to give you praise and we're going to worship you in spirit and truth. And what's beautiful in this moment, these captives who are worshiping in front of a literal captive audience. Because we don't know what the other prisoners were in there for, but they're like, these guys had a bad day, but their day is better than our day, but they're in the same place. What is it about them? What is it about their story? Why is it different for them? Because they're going through the same things, but there's something different about them. What is it? It's because they know who God is. They know that he's God of their story, and they're willing to worship regardless. See, worship is your response when you have a view of God, a proper belief, a proper understanding of God. And so here's a question I have for you tonight. What do you need to regain about who God is so you can worship again? What do you need to understand about who God is so worship can be your story once again? So you can begin to return to him and give him more of yourself, because God, I see who you are, and who you are is greater than where I find myself today. Because worship is not dependent on your preference. It's not dependent on your circumstance. Worship's dependent on your response to who God is. But more than that, listen, this is why your worship matters. Who needs to see your life of worship? Because their life sucks just as much as yours. But you have a hope that transcends it, and they need to see the reality of that hope in your story so that they will return to the one they were created to worship. So your worship is your witness to the world around you. That come what may, the challenges, the circumstances, I know who God is. He has changed my story, so I will give him all of me. And so I want to invite you in this time as we go into musical worship. Don't just let this be a song with lyrics on a screen. Let this be a declaration of your heart. God, I want to give myself to you. I want to experience what I was created for, which is to worship you and to know you. And so tonight, if you got to do some business, God, remind me of what I've forgotten so that I can engage with you as I was created to do so. Invite him to show himself to you tonight. And then as the song ends and we go on with the night, let your worship carry on with your life tomorrow. May Monday be a day of worship as you practice his presence and seek his truth to transform your story. So Lord, we're coming into this time to worship you, to give ourselves to you. God, wherever we find ourselves, would we be true worshipers, those who would worship you in spirit and truth, that you've come, you've changed our story. And so this song is nothing more than an offering we give you to show you and share with you the intention of our heart, our desire that we would know you more. So God, would you make yourself known? Would you reveal yourself to us so that we would experience you, the one we were created for and by, to whose glory we are chasing. So come and meet us tonight. So let's go into this time and worship him together.